We're having far too few children to replace ourselves. The more money we have, the richer we are, the less children we have. There's a basic change in the temperament, in the character of the population. Well, the first thing is the birth rate crisis is going to get worse. If you look at the attitudes of the youngest generation, they're even more extreme than those, say, 10 or 20 years ago. There's a steady decline.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's amazing guest, first time on the channel, gentleman called Jim Penman, who runs a franchise group called Jim's Group in Australia and New Zealand. First of all, Jim, welcome to the show, and thank you for coming along today.
Good to be here, Nick.
I saw one of your tweets last week when I contacted you, and you were talking about the declining birth rate in the Western world. And straight away, I was like, oh, that pricked my ears. It's like, I want to know more about this. So I reached out, and you very kindly decided to come on the podcast and we can talk about it. So let's start this conversation by explaining what's going on in the West. So first of all, is it true that in the West, our birth rate is declining? Is that necessarily a problem if it is declining?
Birth rate is certainly declining. To have enough children to replace ourselves, we need 2.1 babies per woman. We're currently in most Western countries doing about 1.5. We're actually a lot better than East Asia, where it's down to, say, 1.1 in Japan and 0.7 in Korea. So we're having far too few children to replace ourselves. And it's actually been getting worse. We had a peak, post-war period, 1950s and so forth, and it's been declining, with ever since.
Could this be a natural cycle that populations rise, populations fall? We get to a stage where we're having more children, but then that becomes unfashionable, or that then becomes uneconomical, so therefore we have less children. Then we get to a stage then where it becomes fashionable again to have more children, or is that just a load of rubbish that I've just made up?
It's not going to reverse itself. It's the same process that happened in Roman Empire and many other ancient civilizations. When you get a wealthy commercial society, birth rates tend to drop. And they drop most in cities, and particularly amongst the elites, the people who are best fed. That's a pattern from thousands of years ago in the ancient world. We're seeing the same thing happen in the West, but much, much more quickly. So it's, when you say it is fashionable to have less children now, but the real question is what lies behind it. And what I see is this. People, when you ask them, they say, why don't they have more children? They say because they can't afford it. It's too expensive, and children are costly, and rents and mortgages are high, and this kind of stuff. But the interesting thing is that the correlation goes the other way. The more money we have, the richer we are, the less children we have. And the individuals in society have the least children, those who could most afford it, which is the elites. So it's quite the opposite. So what is actually happening is that people's priority are changing. In the past, you asked, you go back, say, 50 years ago, and you asked young people, and there's things like the General Social Survey, ask people what they wanted out of life. Family and children come right at the top. They come very, very high. Meaningful job comes very high. If you ask the same question to young people now, they'll say those things go way, way down. Other things like, leisure, status, wealth, having a good time, those kind of things come way, way up. So there's a basic change in the temperament, in the character of the population.
Which I would say is we've become a lot more selfish. We can see that throughout society. I mean, we've got to a stage now where we're aborting millions of babies, tens of millions of babies in the West every year. We dump our old folks in homes for strangers to look after them. It's all about me, 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 me. Part of that, I would imagine, could be a natural trait. It's a survival strategy to be selfish to a certain extent, because then you make sure you get food, you get protection. But if it goes too far, then you isolate yourself from the tribe as well. Is there anything else behind why we're not having children? I mean, let me tell you some of the things that I hear that I may think could possibly be true. So you've already busted the myth, which once you said it, it was fairly obvious. we're having less children because we can't afford it, but we're the richest we've ever been, with the most wealth, the most comfort, and so I can't believe I believed that one for a moment, but I did until you said it out loud. It was like pretty obvious that's not the case. Obviously, we're selfish. Um, we've also got, I mean, I was going to say it could do with sperm rates, but we're aborting that many babies. It can't be. Is there anything else? What do you think's driving this apart from a human trait of being selfish?
Well, you're quite right, it's selfishness. At the same time as you've seen the birth rate collapse, you've also seen a collapse in community. People a lot more lonely and separated, individualistic, also more depressed, more anxious, more drug addiction, more abuse, more deaths of despair, as they say. So there's been a big, big change. This is actually a psychological reaction. You really have to go into the epigenetics of human behavior. What's happening is that our bodies are reacting to prosperity in about the same way as we react to cocaine. It all comes down to the dopamine system. If you take cocaine or some other drug similar, what it does is give a spurt of dopamine into your brain, very intense. And the brain reacts to that by dialing down the dopamine receptor. It means that you need a lot more to be satisfied. And that's why people, addicts, need more and more and more. And eventually they need quite a lot of cocaine just to feel normal because their dopamine receptors are so depressed. And that actually means that normal source of dopamine, like for a healthy person, spending time with your children, with your partner, walk in the forest, those kind of things, even doing a job, a basic, simple, repetitive job, is boring. It's less interesting, and you want excitement, you want gambling, you want parties, you want all the things, the competition that give you more boosts of dopamine because you're so starved for it, because your body's not reacting to it. Now, that's how cocaine works, and that's why it's so deadly. And that's the same thing with alcohol or any other kind of addiction, including porn, anything. They all work the same way. You get these bursts of dopamine, social media, bursts of dopamine. Your body reacts by dialing down the dopamine receptors. Now, in effect, that's what's happened to us worldwide. It's like we've become addicted to cocaine, but the cocaine is actually not the drug, but it's the prosperity and the commercialism and the thrills of the modern world is so attractive that our brains are shutting down our dopamine receptors, and therefore children are boring. Now, if you love children are wonderful. But if you find them boring, anything is better. Career, excitement, travel, they're better. So that's what's basically happened. What we're doing is working out a way to try and reverse this problem, to actually make our brains more sensitive to dopamine, which will be a very good way of coping with drug addiction. But in the process, it will actually solve the birth rate crisis.
I'm sure you're well aware of experiments that were done. I think it was the 80s, called Rat Utopia or Mouse Utopia, where they got lots of either rats or mice, built like a heaven for them. Free food, free this, lots of toys, no predators, they didn't have to work. And within 30 days, the colonies were collapsing because they'd become lazy. The females were aborting their babies, they were cannibalizing the young, but they had everything they ever needed. But something was missing. Is that what's happening to us? There's some things missing. And could that thing missing, could that be religion?
Well, religion is part of the problem. To maintain our receptors, our dopamine receptors strong, what you need to do is to actually limit these things that cause spurts of dopamine. And that's what religions actually do to a large extent. For example, one of the things religion says is you shouldn't have sex outside marriage, particularly when you're young, like a teenager and so forth. Because sex, especially early and especially with the variety of people, is a very potent dopamine booster. If you have religious system to say you shouldn't do that, well, then you're strengthening your dopamine receptors so that things like work, family, so forth become more interesting and more attractive. Religion does that in a lot of different ways. It actually stops us being so egotistical. We submit to the will of God, to the community, or whatever. We think fasting, for example, we limit our food intake. Obviously, most religious people are discouraged from using things like drugs and alcohol to excess and so forth. So it's all part of the same process. So you're completely right. Religion is actually one of the forces that has built the character that's made us successful in the past. And as religion has died away, partly as a result, it's partly a cause of this whole process.
Let's talk about this point now. Has any of this got to do with mass immigration? Is mass immigration itself a contributory factor to this, or are we using mass immigration to compensate for us not having enough children?
Mass immigration has nothing to do with it. This process happens whether you've got immigration or not. In fact, if you get immigrants from more disciplined countries, like, say, until recently, China and India, you're actually strengthening population. You find in Western countries, a lot of these immigrants are actually very successful. They work harder than natives and so forth. So we're a response. We're not having enough children of our own, so people are flooding into our wealthy society. And as they do, of course, their birth rate drops as well. So yeah, people blame immigration, but I know it's a big issue these days. But the problem is, you can bring people in to replace the fact that we're not having babies. But in the end, what you do is you submerge and you lose your own culture. And I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. It's not good to have a shrinking population from so many points of view. It's not good because of the problem with social welfare. You're going to have one of these days, you're going to have a quarter population retired. How are you going to support them? And there's less and less working people, less and less children coming through. How do you look after them? How do you change their bedpans? How do you support them in old age if you haven't got enough people? It's a terrible thing. But the other thing too is it's not just a matter of the birth rate, Nick. There's a change in psychology that's making us less hardworking. There's more and more people, especially young men, who are not in the workplace at all. The rise of disability and stuff. We're losing our work ethic, as we're losing our religion, as we're losing our desire for families, for children. All these things are being lost at the same time. And the end result's not just a shrinking population, but one that's increasingly poor.
I think what you're describing now sounds a lot like civilization collapse, where, yeah, and we've seen it, we could name off a dozen empires that we've heard of or read about, but those empires don't exist anymore now because they're collapsed. Everything has a beginning, everything has an end. Are we at the beginning now of the end of the Western civilization?
Well, we are if we don't do anything about it. But the really amazing thing about the modern world, look, the Romans collapsed. You've got someone like the Emperor Augustus, who was the most powerful man in the world about 2,000 years ago. And he's lecturing his nobles to say, you have got to start having kids. You've got to get married. You've got to have children. He told them off. It's a big public speak. And that's happened a lot in the past. When the population starts to decline, the rulers get concerned about it. Same thing happened in Ptolemaic Egypt, in Han China. The rulers get concerned. They start to say, well, let's push people to have more children. Let's tax them and bonuses and all kinds of things. We'll try and make them. It doesn't work because there's this societal change which is based on wealth and prosperity. The big difference in the modern world is that we now have the biological science that we can do something about it. We can change character in a way. Now, one of the really interesting things that's happened lately is that you've got these weight loss drugs like semaglutide, and they actually seem to have some of the same effects. We're about to try some of these in rats to see if it makes them better mothers. We suspect it will. And even if it doesn't, they could be tweaked in certain ways. They would actually have this effect that we need. In other words, what we need is a medication, a treatment. And that treatment would actually be very good for things like recovering from drug addiction, treating symptoms like ADHD in children, for example. That's a very prime one. Certain kinds of depression, loneliness, or lots of different things. If we could find the proper treatments, we could actually treat these things. And in the process, we could solve the birth rate crisis.
let's go into these treatments. So, what exactly are you doing now about this?
What we're actually doing is we've tested in a recent assay, we tested 1,000 different drugs in nerve cells. You put little tiny capsules and you put your nerve cells in and you put the drugs in. What you're looking for is an epigenetic signature. Um, just to explain, epigenetics is the way that the environment affects our functioning of our genes. If you look at genes as being a sort of series of little taps that spit out proteins, that's how they work. What epigenetics does is it turns these little taps on or off. So it's not part of the genes themselves. It's something that sits on top of them. There's a thing called a methyl group that sits on and shuts a gene down. There's lots of different places you can shut it down. How much you shut it down depends on how much the effect is. So that's what's happened. We know the effect of food restriction is the best way to study it. So we've been doing this in rats for 10 years. So we know what the epigenetic signature is like. So what we've done is we tested 1,000 of these drugs and we looked for the epigenetic signature that suggested it had the same effect as food restriction. And then we put those down and we started to test some of those in animals, including one of the weight loss drugs.
So, you're hoping for a medical solution to this. Um, most medicines,
Wildly radical. It's nothing anybody else is thinking about. They're all thinking baby bonuses and stuff because people say it's money, but it doesn't work. So yes, you're right. Medical solution is what we need.
yeah, I mean, I'm never going to say it's money anymore. Well, once you said that out loud, it just was like, I can't believe I was believing that, because once you said out loud, it's like, that's just obvious. So that's a medical solution to this problem. As you know, that's going to be very, very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very difficult. What's going to be the disaster that awaits us if this drug doesn't come on the market, ASAP, and we don't figure out this problem? What's going to be the long-term effects in the West?
Well, the first thing is the birth rate crisis is going to get worse. If you look at the attitudes of the youngest generation, they're even more extreme than those, say, 10 or 20 years ago. There's a steady decline. So you're going to the birth rate continue to go down. People think it's at bottom. It is not. It's going to get worse. You're going to get economic stagnation. Productivity is going to freeze. And then we're going to start going backwards. See, the interesting thing is we've got all this magical new technology and IT and AI and everything else and all the new biology, but we're not getting richer, are we? Ordinary people's income is not rising. The very rich, the top 1%, the 0.1%, they're doing pretty well. But more and more people are struggling. We're not getting wealthier. Eventually, we're going to go into downturn. We're going to go back towards subsistence. Those of us who are left, the few of us who are left, will go back to subsistence farming. It happened in the Roman Empire. Rome didn't collapse just because the barbarians came in. By the time the barbarians broke in, basically the economy was already a fraction of what it used to be. You can see this in the metal in the Greenland ice caps. It went down well before the end of the actual Roman Empire. What you're also going to see is a decline in what you might call impersonal values. Things like the rule of law, democracy, republican ideas, all these sorts of things are going to decline, and you're going to see a transition to one-man rule. It's, as happened in the late Republic in Rome, where you got these great leaders like Sulla and Pompey and Caesar, who eventually seized power, and you go from a republic to a monarchy. That's going to happen with us. When it goes down far enough, the whole thing falls apart, if it does. In our modern world, you'll probably just get mass immigration from more vigorous and fertile people, like from the Middle East, who will take over. They won't go that far. But if it eventually went far enough, the government would just break apart because everybody's loyalties is too personal. They're all to your neighbor, to the local baron, the local landlord, whatever, rather than to the constitution, the state. You can already see a sign of this in America, where for the first time ever, a leader like Donald Trump in 2020 said, I didn't lose the election. It was stolen from me, and tens of millions of Americans agree with him. So there's a real thing. Now you're getting control of the military. If he said, I want a third term, who's going to stop him? Now, it probably won't go that far, but that's the something we're getting into. Loyalties have become less impersonal, less honesty, the rule of law, parliament, democracy, more who am I loyal to? What individual am I loyal to?
And a lot of this we've seen and we've learned from history. So history is a cycle. Things come, things go. It's always a cycle. And we've seen what happens before with the collapse of civilizations, the collapse of city states. We know that they're in the history books. And if you look closely enough, maybe we are repeating everything that's happened before. So maybe a collapse is coming. And if a collapse does come, you're quite right. It'll go violent. People will survive. The strongest will survive, and the strong men will take over because that's what strong men do. Before we had the civilization we've got now, where we've got parliaments and we've got politicians, strong men always take over. My final question is this: are you optimistic?
Yes, I'm optimistic because of the incredible advances made in the biological sciences. For the first time in history, we actually know what's going on. We can actually see this. We can see the things. We can test them. We've got this amazing biological revolution, understanding of the genetic code, of epigenetics. It does make it possible to change this. I'm very optimistic it will happen. The thing of it is, when you've got to talk about a medical treatment, as I said before, it doesn't actually have to solve the birth rate by itself. There are so many issues. People are getting miserable. But anxiety, depression is rising, loneliness is going up, drug addiction, deaths of despair, all these things are actually causing immense problem. If we can produce a medication or a series of medication that will solve this problem, and I'm pretty confident we can, then that will by itself, it will change everything. Now, a good example of how this can work is the Great Depression. Now, you get a situation, the birth rate had been declining for quite a long time in Western countries. And then you get this situation after the Second World War in many Western countries, you have this surge. It's called the baby boom, particularly in Australia, America, places like that. So you get this baby boom. Now, it's interesting when you look at that. You look at the actual people who had the babies, those who are having children in the 1950s, they were the ones that passed their late childhood, ages between about 6 and 12, during the Great Depression. And the more severe the depression, the bigger the effect. So they had this natural experiment where you subject late childhood is the particular age, and then when those children came of age in the 50s, they were very community minded, very religious, but they also had lots and very devoted to family, lots and lots of children. So we can do the same thing. That is the great excitement of our modern age. All these problems which people think are unsolvable, it's not even that difficult. We're spending every year, site across the world, hundreds of billions of dollars to try and solve this problem. To actually find a solution, you're talking about maybe $100 or $200 million, which is like a rounding error on what we're doing so uselessly to cope this. And there's probably 5 or 10,000 people in the world who could afford to make such a thing happen. We're talking about heads of state, wealthy individuals, drug companies. All you have to do is to have one of those people say, let's give this a try, bearing in mind that such a medication would also make you fabulously wealthy, whoever did it. Let's give it a try. And you'll develop something and it'll start working, and then people will tweak it and they'll make it work better, and then they'll see the benefits. And the people who've got children who've got ADHD, and they start applying for that, which is a really good one, they're going to find these children growing up, instead of being difficult to employ and so forth, suddenly these are the stars. Suddenly these are super successful, they're hardworking, they're getting educated. What's going on? We're treating them for ADHD and suddenly they're becoming successful. And if people see other people's children being selfless, I want that for myself too. I want layabout children who are going to sort of get off on drugs and stuff. I want successful kids. So you'll see this change taking place. It really only needs one person to actually make that decision. And this will work. It will happen.
And again, we've seen that throughout history, one person inventing something that changes the whole planet. And there's one thing I know about the human species. we're amazing. We're inventive. We solve problems. We always have done. That's why we are where we are now. You know, most of us will never contribute, but we do produce people who can see beyond the stars, who think differently, who can see a different future where most of us can only see what's in front of us. But and a lot of those people never produce anything, but they had a dream, and having a dream, and we're the creatures that want to chase those dreams. So I hope you carry on chasing that, and I hope you are successful, because from this discussion, it's fairly obvious that we need something. The West needs something.
Yeah, we do. Well, Birth Rate Crisis is coming out probably early next year, and it's going to hopefully make an impact. We're actually not only going to do an English language version, we're going to do languages and versions in Korea, Japanese, Chinese, and we're going to push this really, really hard. We just need someone to listen and say, let's give it a try. Let's give basic scientific research a try. And once that happens, and once people see the success, we'll solve this crisis and a lot of other things at the same time.
Oh, Jim, you've cheered me up. That's a great place to end. You've cheered me up. Thank you so much for coming on today. It's been worth it from my point of view, because I'm going to stop telling people now that we've got this crisis because of finances, because even I know now that's a load of rubbish.
Yeah, you're dead right, Nick.
Thanks, Jim, and hopefully I'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah, good to talk.
Bye-bye.